Welcome everyone to part 2 of Unit 8, Clinical Psychology. Today we're going to be talking about our depressive disorders, bipolar disorder, suicide, and self-injury. So the first thing that we want to discuss when we're talking about kind of these more depressive disorders and disorders that are kind of relatively linked to them is understanding the difference between sadness and depression. This is a really important kind of key concept that we have to have. So one thing that's really important is sadness itself actually is not necessarily a negative thing, even though I think we kind of have this idea that being sad is only negative. There actually are some things that are kind of positive or some things that we gain from sadness, right? So for example, one thing about sadness is it slows us down. It tends to kind of slow down what we're doing. It tends to cause us to maybe take a little more time in deciding what we're going to do next. It prompts us to reassess, which is kind of what I just was talking about there, where it's going to kind of encourage us to look at what are we doing, what kind of actions are we doing, what are our goals, where are we directing our energy, and to maybe reassess what those things are. And then lastly, after we kind of slowed down, after we've reassessed, it can also cause us to redirect our energy. So something happens, maybe let's say like I have a end of a really bad relationship, right, which makes me sad. It slows me down a little bit. I start to kind of reassess and readjust, where should I be putting my energy? Where should I be putting my time? What are the things I did well? What are the things maybe I shouldn't have done or could do better? And then I can redirect my energy into maybe a place that's going to be better served. So sadness itself actually does have some kind of positive things that come out of it. Now, when we're talking about depression, right, it's really important to understand kind of the key difference between sadness and depression has to do with how impactful and how long-lasting they're going to be. So the example that is kind of on here that I think is pretty useful is the idea that sadness and depression are related, right, the same way that breathing heavy after a hard run and being chronically exhausted are related. Where the feelings may be relatively similar, but the depth is much, much deeper, right? Depression is going to be a far deeper emotion, a far more impactful emotion that you're feeling. It's going to tend to feel like it lasts a lot longer, right? Where sadness can be, it's not that you can't be sad for, what feels like a long period of time, but depressive disorders are just going to be much, much more impactful and damaging. And then two, obviously, like sadness, generally we can tie very closely to specific things, right? Generally speaking, right, you're not just going to be sad for no reason, right? Something happens to you and that makes you sad. Depression, although obviously we can tie it to specific events as well, will oftentimes kind of outlast or sometimes maybe even not have a specific cause, right? So we're going to kind of see some differences in how they present themselves. Another thing that's really important to think about with depression is that depression is the number one reason people seek mental health services. So this is the biggest thing that we're going to see if you became a psychologist or you became a psychiatrist, right? Depression is the number one most common thing that people are going to seek help to deal with. So let's start talking about some of these different actual disorders. So our first one is major depressive disorder. So major depressive disorder is characterized where basically we are going to experience a certain number of symptoms for a certain length of time, right? And this is also what we're going to see in our next example as well. So basically for at least 2 weeks, so 2 or more weeks, someone has to experience at least 5 of the following symptoms, including depressed mood and or the loss of interest and pleasure. Okay, so basically you have to kind of meet this criteria to be considered to have major depressive disorder. So some of the different symptoms that we could see are problems in thinking, concentrating, or making decisions, significant challenges regulating appetite and weight, significant challenges regulating sleep, physical agitation or lethargy, feeling listless or with much less energy, feeling worthless or feeling unwarranted guilt, and thinking repetitively of death or suicide. So again, you would have a combination of at least 5 of these. And so you can kind of imagine how if you picked any, random 5 on that list, and then you added in depressed mood, or you added in loss of interest or pleasure, that's going to be a pretty debilitating thing to deal with. Okay. Now, obviously, like in our technical definition, this is going to be, when we're experiencing this and there's no outside factors that could be causing it. So, for example, like drugs or some sort of other medical condition, right? That would obviously, if we're taking drugs and it's causing us to feel this way, it might not be depression. It's maybe, the drugs that we're taking. So that would obviously be something different. One thing we see with major depressive disorder is, like you can see there, it's lasts for 2 or more weeks. So that's obviously a pretty extended period of time. But major depressive disorder isn't going to tend to last incredibly long, right? It's not super common for people to have major depressive disorder for like years. But these are going to be kind of a very, very deep depression. That's the major depressive disorder. This is important when we look at our next example, which is persistent depressive disorder. And really the biggest difference is that major depressive disorder is going to be shorter, but much deeper. Deeper depression, but it's not going to last as long. Persistent depressive disorder is going to be much milder of a depression, but it's going to last far longer. All right. So the way that we would define or look for or diagnose persistent depressive disorder, it is a mildly depressed mood more often than not for 2 or more years. Okay, so you can see how that's a very, very long period of time. Now, again, what it means is it says more often than not. It doesn't necessarily mean that someone with persistent depressive disorder is like feeling this mildly depressed mood every single day for 2 years, but the majority of the time, right? Most days, over half, obviously, they are going to feel this mildly depressed mood. Now, some of the symptoms we see with that are difficulty with decision making and concentrating, feeling hopeless, poor self-esteem, reducing energy levels, problems regulating sleep, problems regulating appetite. So you can kind of see how these are definitely much less kind of extreme than we see with major depressive disorder. But again, the bigger difference is that it's going to last for 2 or more years. 2 years is the minimum. So that's obviously a very long period of time to be dealing with these feelings, right? And I kind of like the image here. Actually, I think it's kind of a nice way of representing is where for most people, if we aren't dealing with this persistent depressive disorder, you kind of like go through your days, and there's hard days and easy days and good days and bad days, but you kind of can just kind of go through. Where with persistent depressive disorder, it's kind of like always an uphill climb. Right? It's not necessarily like you're falling into a pit, but it just feels very hard. It's very challenging to get through every single day because of these different symptoms that we're experiencing. So that kind of wraps up at least the 2 depressive disorders that will look like. There are a few others, but those are the kind of the 2 big ones that we care about. And what we're going to talk about now is bipolar disorder. So bipolar disorder is not a depressive disorder, but it is kind of connected, because bipolar disorder is basically where someone is going to alternate between depression and mania. So we're moving between that hopeless, lethargic state of depression where we're just slow and we're not able to do anything and we're not motivated and we're we feel that hopelessness, and into what is called a mania. So mania is a hyperactive, wildly optimistic state in which people are dangerously poor judgment is really, really common. So what's going to happen when we see a mania, and we'll see an example in the video we watch in class, is you'll have somebody who suddenly becomes like incredibly energized. They're incredibly optimistic. They're incredibly passionate. So they kind of like just run full force into anything. So people that are in manias will go through and like maybe they're maybe for example they start having like all these ideas. Maybe they're an inventor or something like that, right? And they have all these ideas of these things that they're going to create, and they start working, like 24/7 around the clock on this thing, and they've got tons and tons and tons of energy, and they're incredibly excited, and they're super, super optimistic that what they're doing is going to be impactful and life-changing and change the world. To the point where it's actually dangerous, right? So people with mania are like so overly optimistic that they will do things that are incredibly reckless and can have really negative consequences. So there's examples of people with manias going and basically just gambling all of their money away over like a weekend. And like losing their house, losing everything in a weekend, where maybe before they weren't even really big gamblers, but they just felt so optimistic and they're so passionate about what they're doing that they kind of like recklessly will rush into things. So again, for bipolar disorder, what's happening is we're alternating between those two, where we'll go from this helpless, depressed state to this mania. Now, there are parts in between, so it's not like you are only one of these two. There's also kind of like just like a regular middle ground. So they'll go through periods of time where they will just be kind of neutral, kind of where they're not dealing with mania or depression. So there are kind of these middle grounds, but we would say that someone has to have these two different, these two sides, right? That's the bipolar part, to have bipolar disorder. Oops, sorry, I didn't want to play that. So understanding depressive and bipolar disorder. So there's some things that we just kind of want to talk about with these in general. So when we're looking at depression specifically, and also manias, when we're talking about bipolar disorder, what we're going to see is not just behavioral changes, but also cognitive changes. So the way that people think is going to literally be different, right? Their thought processes are going to be different. And obviously their behavior is going to be very different. If someone is depressed, there are behavioral differences that you can see in how they act, as well as obviously like if you obviously can't see what they're thinking necessarily, but they are also like literally thinking about things differently. We also know that depression is very widespread. Again, it's pretty clear from the very first slide when we mentioned that it is the number one reason people seek mental health support. We also know that women's risk of major depressive disorder is nearly double that of men's. So this is something we talked about, I think, earlier in development, if I remember correctly, where we see that actually women are far more likely to have anxiety disorders, women are far more likely to have depressive disorders. And so again, obviously we don't necessarily have a reason, at least for this class, as to why that is, but we do tend to see differences based on gender when it comes to depressive disorder, specifically major depressive disorder. We also know that most depressive episodes self-terminate. Now, this is kind of an interesting one. So what this means is basically that for the most part, the majority of people with depression will eventually just kind of get past it. They'll kind of like, I don't know the best terminology to use here, I guess, but they'll basically, because I don't want to say get over it, but they will basically move on. They'll get out of this depressed state. It will just go away. And this is a really interesting thing. Obviously, we can kind of think about how this affects how we treat it. This affects how we interact with it in general. But people can experience depression, and even without getting any help, obviously help is good and useful. But even without that, for most people, eventually the depression will just kind of end. It'll just kind of go away. Some people obviously might come back. But generally speaking, it'll just kind of go away, even if untreated. And again, this is obviously something that could be very different than if we look at maybe other disorders, something like OCD that we talked about last class, where we often tend to see it progress, where it gets kind of more and more extreme. The same thing, the next video we'll look at schizophrenia, which is another one that if not treated will oftentimes get worse. Depression doesn't tend to generally be like that. Now it can, but most of the time it will just kind of self-terminate and go away, or people will get through it. We do see that stressful events related to work, marriage, and close relationships are often preceding depression. Now, this kind of makes sense if you think about, how sadness works, right? Obviously, when something happens, that can make you sad. Same thing, same kind of idea here, that when negative things happen, when stressful things happen, when anxiety-ridden things happen, it can then cause or precede this depression that you may be able to fall into. And then we also know, or we've been seeing, I guess, that depression seems to be striking earlier and affect more people than in past generations. So today, if we looked at children, for example, we'd be more likely we'd see more children that are dealing with depression than we would have maybe 40, 50 years ago. We're also seeing it happen to younger kids than we maybe would have 40, 50 years ago. Now, this obviously, there's kind of a lot of additional things that have to be done here, right, to figure out, okay, what's happening, why do we see this, what's causing this. There's also one big possibility, especially when it comes to psychological disorders, is when we look at these things, is it that we're actually seeing, is something actually changing that's causing more people to be depressed and younger? Or is it that we're actually just paying attention to it now where before we weren't, right? This is another one that if we talked, when we talk about like something like ADHD is a really big one where for a long period of time, there wasn't really ADHD. So obviously, you know, now if people are looking for it, right, we're gonna find more of it, and that's gonna make it seem like there's maybe more of it than there used to be. Where the reality is we have to kind of adjust those numbers. So just another thing to kind of be taking into account when we're thinking about looking at disorders over time specifically. So that's going to get us into talking just a very little bit about suicide and self-injury. Now, we're not going to get super deep into this. It's really more just kind of about a few general pieces of information that are necessary for us. So one thing that's important is suicide is not considered a psychological disorder. It's a specific action, right? And the big thing that we really care about, at least for this kind of level class, is thinking about how do we help people here. So one of the things that's really important is we kind of talk about there's kind of three things that we should be doing to help someone who is talking about suicide, right? As well as obviously if it's ourself, right, kind of trying to go through these processes. So the first thing that's super important is listening and empathizing. We want to pay attention and care for this person as they talk about this thing that they're dealing with. The second thing that's really important is as a student, right? Obviously, this would look a little bit different if you were an adult, but connecting that person to help. This one is super important. One thing that's very critical is, especially as a teenager or as a child, but even as an adult, the reality is we as regular people are not prepared and not trained and not should not be dealing with trying to get somebody through something like depression, get somebody through something like suicidal ideation. So the second step is to connect that person to help, to professionals. So school psychologists, school counselors, suicide prevention lines, crisis text lines. Those are all places where there are professionals who are trained specifically with, you know, this is how we deal with this. This is how we help this person. This is the things that we're going to do to make sure that they end up okay. And the last part is kind of more extreme, where at some point it may be protecting that person. So protecting them by seeking help from an adult or something like 911. Now, generally this is referring more to like, you know, not just someone saying like, hey, I've been really sad. You don't necessarily want to, you know, call 911 immediately when that happens. This is more of, you know, I think that somebody I know might commit suicide tonight or right now. And I need to make sure that they are protected and that somebody's there to take care of them. Now, again, this stuff is really important, especially because, like we just mentioned, most depressive episodes self-terminate. So obviously, you know, like we saw with major depressive disorder, thinking repeatedly of death or suicide is one of those symptoms. But so we can see where someone who would be having these feelings or having these kind of thoughts, right? One thing we know is that if we can get them help, for the vast majority of people, they will get better. For the vast majority of people, that depression will subside. That suicidal kind of ideation will subside and go away. So it's really important that we, you know, care for and protect these people. That way, you know, hopefully we can get them to the point where they can kind of get past it and they can kind of move on in a healthier way. The last piece is non-suicidal self-injury, which is sometimes broken down to NSSI. So this is kind of an interesting one because we're looking at, you know, why people hurt themselves, right? Where we're not necessarily trying to commit suicide, but we are injuring ourselves. We're causing self-injury. And so one of the big questions would be, why? Why do people do this? Because obviously, biologically, it doesn't really make sense, right? Pain is obviously a negative feeling that people generally try to avoid. So psychologically, we'd want to think about, why would people do this? Why does this happen? There's kind of a few things. So for some, it's finding relief from intense negative thoughts through the distraction. So pain is used as a distraction to kind of avoid other very intense negative thoughts. Sometimes it can be used as a way to get attention and possibly get help. Now, it's really important when we say getting attention here. I don't mean this they just want to have attention. It's generally seen as a cry for help of, I am hoping somebody will notice this. That way they will help me. And again, we can kind of think of how, if I'm dealing with something like depression, I may not know how to go out and get help, right? I may not know how to ask someone to help me or, step in. So this might be a way where I can do something where, even if it's subconsciously, I'm kind of hoping that someone will notice and someone will give me the help that I need. It can also sometimes be seen or be used as a way to relieve guilt. So it's a way of punishing yourself, basically, when you feel guilty about something. Getting others to change negative behavior is also another thing. So when somebody else does something we don't like, sometimes it can be used to try and get them to change that behavior. And then also sometimes we even see it to fit in with a peer group. So there's kind of a really big, wide variety of reasons why we might see non-suicidal self-injury. Now, one thing that is, I don't know if this is a positive thing or not, kind of how to phrase it about it, but one thing we do see is that generally speaking, people with non-suicidal self-injury, generally speaking, this does not lead to suicide. It very much can escalate, and this is not by any means saying you shouldn't step in and get people help, where if this is a behavior you see. But generally speaking, someone who is exhibiting non-suicidal self-injury, generally this won't lead into suicide. Generally speaking, this is something where they will either receive help, or again, kind of like our other depressive things that we talked about, it will kind of self-terminate, and they will basically kind of move past whatever it is that's causing them to carry out this behavior. So just to kind of wrap everything up, right, take a few moments, do a quick summary. Obviously, we have our few specific disorders: major depressive disorder, I'm kind of blanking on what I'm thinking right now, persistent depressive disorder, and bipolar disorder. And then we also have, suicide and non-suicidal self-injury, which are very much not necessarily disorders, but behaviors that we see that can obviously be connected with these depressive mood and depressive episodes. So take a few moments, do a quick summary, and I'll see you guys next time.